On today's special crossover episode on Locked On Stars with Locked On Wild host Seth Toupal, we discuss my concerns with the Dallas Stars. Seth shares his thoughts on Dean Evason and are the Wild a true Stanley Cup contender? And lastly, a look at your Central Division. That's next on Locked On Stars.
Your Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to a special crossover episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Stars. Both are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making both Locked On Stars and Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the course of the week. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Stars, we take a look at both the Dallas Stars and the Minnesota Wild as we get set for the start of the season with new Locked On Stars host Joey Erickson. We'll discuss the odds that Jason Robertson and Jake Ottinger can lead the Stars to a new level this season, as well as some areas that the Stars need to improve to try to continue their winning ways. We'll also talk about the Minnesota Wild as well. As mentioned, my name is Seth Toupal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, joined by the new host of Locked On Stars and a fellow St. Cloud State Husky, Joey Erickson. Joey, what's happening?
Howdy. Nothing much. I'm doing well. I've becoming acclimated to Wisconsin now after my 4 years in Minnesota. And I know Minnesotans aren't huge fans of Wisconsinites, but I consider myself one now, at least for the past 2 months. So I'm doing well. Just excited for hockey to be back as well. Training camp and all the preseason games are back into action, which is good news.
Yeah, it's great to have things back into a normal flow. And for you get the double whammy of being a Wisconsinite and also covering the Dallas Stars. And so Wild fans, we'll have some good fun with this rivalry as we have for the last couple of seasons for sure. So, Joey, let's talk about the Stars. I'm curious with your perspective, having now dove in and kind of getting acclimated to covering this team as we get set for the start of this season, looking back at what happened with Dallas last year, where they ended up getting upended by the Vegas Golden Knights. What are some areas that the Stars need to shore up this season to try to take that next step beyond where they went last year?
Yeah, I think the main key, and I think a lot of Stars fans would echo this, is defensively, they just got to shore up on the back end. They were a little bit thin compared to a team like Vegas, and that seems like that's kind of the bar you got to meet with their defensive groups. They were just so deep. They had tons of size and mobility, and the Stars really struggled with fast pace off the rush play, especially with guys like Esa Lindell and Yanni Hakanpää. That was a pairing that really, really struggled, especially against Vegas. I went back and rewatched some of the games against the Golden Knights and Kraken, and that pairing especially got torched just because when Vegas and Seattle was coming downhill, it was really, really tough to stop. So I think defensively is probably the biggest concern because you got to feel pretty good about your forward depth, probably the best you feel about it in about 5 years or so. And even Pete DeBoer mentioned before training camp about, they had a good depth last year, but he thinks they're going to be, instead of maybe 3 lines, actually 4 lines being able to chip in offensively, which is going to be huge. But it looks like they're going to split up your Lindell and Hakanpää, which are 2 of your defensemen that are just not mobile enough, right? Especially in today's NHL. They're not as fleet-footed and they're not as mobile, so they really struggled. And it looks like they're going to split them up, and you're going to play them with a guy like Thomas Harley, who came up at the end of last season and kind of broke out in the playoffs for the Stars. He's going to play with Hakanpää, it looks like, and then Niels Lundqvist, who they're hoping is going to become an everyday established defenseman in the NHL. He played 60 games last year, but then was a healthy scratch throughout the playoffs. They had a little bit of a tight leash on him. So, my biggest concern is the defensive depth. Are they going to have it this year? Who's going to rotate in and out? Because I think from an overarching, very broad perspective, you got a fantastic number one netminder, and you got good forwards up depth, and you got some young guys too that are contributing, and they have that kind of balance right now where they got some of these young guys and the veterans that can get the job done. It was a successful season last year, that's for sure. But for the first time too, it feels like as a Stars fan, you're not feeling the pressure of making the playoffs, where in years past it was, are we going to get in? And I'm sure some Minnesota Wild fans can feel that too, where it's like, yeah, maybe we'll get a wild card spot. We'll be a tough out if we get in. And last year was the first time in years where they played at the top three of the Western Conference for 90% of the season. And with a month to go, you're not worrying like, oh, we got to win 3 out of 5 here in the final month in order to get in. So it was a nice feeling. And I think, I expect them to make the playoffs pretty easily. And, we're not going to have to worry. And of course, injuries and all that good stuff plays into it. But I think you got to feel really good about where they're at right now. And hopefully they can shore up some things defensively. It'll help too. It's year 2 of Pete DeBoer. So everybody kind of knows what to expect. I don't think a lot of us thought it was going to click as fast as it did, but that just seems to be the nature of the NHL too, where it's a coaching carousel and new guys go somewhere and it works right away. So that was good fortune for the Stars for sure.
Now, one of the big additions of the offseason was Matt Duchene, and I'm going to stress this as much as I can. I'm using this anecdote, but not meaning it in the way that it's going to sound.
Okay.
Is that the Stars are hoping the old adage of one man's trash is another man's treasure proves true for Duchene, because the Predators were like, we got to get this guy off the roster. And Dallas says, oh, okay, we'll take him. So what can we expect to see from Matt Duchene in Dallas this season?
Yeah, I know. I completely agree with you. But I think it's exciting and very interesting because you're probably going to see him in more of like your Jamie Benn role, where you're hoping to have a rejuvenation of him, where he's probably going to play less and hopefully he contributes at a higher level, because that's what Jamie Benn did. He played about 2 minutes less than he ever did in previous seasons. And he had an incredible kind of, they kept calling it the Renaissance, right? I think what I'm really intrigued about too is because 56 points last year, leading scorer for the Preds, but I think he's really going to fit in nicely with Seguin and Marchment. I think he just fits like a glove, and DeBoer loves kind of those hybrid centers and wings. He's good in the face-off dot, which is very important. Puck possession in this Pete DeBoer, that's what he's all about, like less dump and chase and things like that. He's a great possession guy. And I think he'll help a lot on the power play. I think he had 15 power play goals a couple of seasons ago, only 5 last year. But who knows how that Predators power play was. Of course, you got Yossi distributing the puck, but other than that, I don't think he had a wonderful personnel around him. So, and he'll probably be on the second power play unit. And to have a guy like that has the potential to score double-digit goals on the power play is very, very intriguing. And look, he is far and away from his prime, but we've seen it now with, especially in Dallas, guys like Pavelski, and, your early 30s is not what it used to be. You can still be a high level player. And yeah, maybe the Stars found some magic here in Duchene, and, he's hungry, which helps. He's never won a cup. I don't think he's really gotten that close either. And you join a list of Stars that haven't either. And you're Ryan Suter's, Minnesota Wild favorite, by the way, and and you're Pavelski. So a ton of intriguing storylines with him, but I think it'll be cool just because he's like going to be a third line winger for you. I think that's a good sign for the Stars.
Yeah, that's an outrageously good spot for him, and it's going to create some matchup nightmares for opponents. So best of luck in Dallas, and for Nashville, they get to do now what Minnesota is doing, which is to live with the buyouts. So good luck there.
Yep.
We will flip and discuss the Minnesota Wild as we continue today's special crossover edition of Locked on Wild and Locked on Stars after this. Get the NFL season started right with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there is no better time to get in on the action. You might get lucky and throw on the Miami Dolphins to beat the Denver Broncos by 50 points. You might get on the bad end of things and have the Minnesota Vikings come down to the wire and ultimately lose against the Los Angeles Chargers. But either way, with FanDuel, you get bonus bets to use on all sorts of props, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So make sure to visit fanduel.com/locked on and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Welcome back to today's special crossover episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on Stars. Again, thank you for making both shows your first listen each and every day. Make sure before the season starts, you subscribe on YouTube, all of your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes, and more importantly, any team news. We know how much things can change day to day in the NHL, so make sure that you check out both shows so that you're up to date when the season starts in October. All right, Joey, your turn to grill me on Minnesota Wild related questions. I am all ears.
Okay. I do want to start here because I know there was some concerns maybe about the bench boss in Dean Evason. He's a guy that, just a quick little spiel for me is that, I think he embodies Minnesota. I really do, like the type of style he wants to play. But it really hasn't translated, I guess, towards, playoff time and certain things like that we've seen in the last few seasons. What is your take on Dean Evason and the type of job he's done since he's been at the helm?
Well, you're spot on in that it seems like the regular season success has been tremendous. This is a team that, with $14 million just floating off in the distance, they have managed to, in back-to-back seasons, win 53 and 46 games. And so obviously there is something that is working in the regular season. Now, there are a couple of other variables that come into play. The level of opponent that you're playing is certainly one of them. Sometimes you catch a team on the second night of a back-to-back. There are a few different things that come into play, but this team has, over the last few seasons especially, really done a good job of winning games and finding a style that wins them those games. Postseason is a different story because now we have, I think it's 4 different postseasons, one of which was in the bubble. We have seen against the Vegas Golden Knights, the Wild lose in 7 games in a game in which Jonas Brodin ended up leaving the game early, and the team just was not able to overcome that type of a loss. But we have, in the last 2 postseasons, seen 6-game exits that have largely looked the same. The St. Louis Blues 2 years ago, it was Kirill Kaprizov and friends, a team that had a 2-1 lead and watched it evaporate and disappear because the opposing coach made a ton of changes and tried to attack things in a different light. Last year, it was a supporting cast that helped out Kirill Kaprizov, who was still trying to get back to 100% after getting injured in the regular season. Had a 2-1 lead, and it evaporated. Special teams has been bad the last 2 postseasons especially, and it just seems like there aren't a lot of adjustments on the home side when you get into games that matter most, when you're going up against an opponent multiple times in a row to where they can look at film and say, okay, they did this in this game, so let's go to something else for the next game to try to attack them in a different manner. And I heard this when Gerard Gallant was let go by the New York Rangers. A national radio show host was talking about the reasons that the Rangers were not as successful as they could have been. It's because they said, well, Gallant has his style that he plays, and if you beat his style, tip of the cap, right back to what we were doing the next night. And I was just sitting there and I'm like,
bingo.
That's Dean. Dean's got a style that he plays that will win you a lot of games, but if the team that you're playing ends up beating you, it's a tip of the cap and it's kind of right back to what got you there. So that's, I think, one of the big issues. The other is just, it seems like a lack of willingness to get younger players involved. I mean, we
Yeah.
had Marco Rossi last year, Kalen Addison last year as well. He seems to much more heavily rely on veteran players to kind of get it done. And so, with the team that is hampered financially to the point that it's going to be tough for this team to be a serious Stanley Cup contender until these buyouts are gone, it would lead you to believe that you should kind of try to see what you have with young
Yeah.
players and give them better opportunities. And we have not seen it really over the last couple of years. And so I think those are the two big rubs for fans with Dean Evason. And so if he kind of softens in both of those instances, then I think we could maybe see a little bit of a change of heart for Wild fans. But at this point, until that stuff changes, the general consensus from a lot of fans is kind of that annoyance at those two big issues.
And I think that kind of perfectly segues into a bit to my next question I wanted to ask you, because I was hearing about it ever since I feel like I entered college, right? Marco Rossi, we got Sammy Walker. When are those guys going to, finally get their opportunity? Who would you think is really going to finally have that big contribution or the big season? Because it feels like you'll really need one of those guys, a few of those guys to hit with the cap situation. You got to have young talent that's cheap, right? who would, because you've been waiting for Rossi forever. What are your expectations for him? Is he going to be an everyday NHL player this year?
That's the hope. He is at this point kind of lined up to be, at least to start, a third liner for this team. And credit to him in the offseason. He stayed in Minnesota the entire offseason, was working with the strength and conditioning coach and the Wild skating coach as well. He put on something like 15 pounds of muscle to help win some of those battles along the boards and not be a player that can just kind of get moved off the puck. But it does feel for me, and I know there's kind of this rush to throw the bust label on players, but I do just really feel like this season is one where we're going to have to see something from Rossi, because it's pretty evident that he is better than an AHL player.
Yeah.
With what he's done in Iowa the last couple of seasons, he just has lit Iowa AHL competition up. So it's pretty clear that he is not an AHL player, but we just haven't seen things translate at the NHL level yet. And it doesn't have to necessarily be points, because I know points is it sometimes is tricky to tack those to a player to determine success. But with NHL players, it seems like what you see, if you see it, that they are NHL players. And so if we can just see a guy who looks like he belongs at the NHL level, that was kind of what set Brock Faber apart, what set Matt Boldy apart, Sammy Walker as well, a player who had a nice call up last year. They just look like guys that belong. And so if we can get that from Rossi this year, I think that's going to be a huge sigh of relief for fans, for the organization, because if he has another stretch like that where he comes up and it just doesn't look like you would hope it would, then I don't know what we do.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because, of course, a guy that's so highly touted and drafted that high, you expect him to, he's going to have 80 points in the NHL every year, and that's what you want. But sometimes it's just not the way it pans out. And some guys just have to be role players. And, in Dallas, we understand the whole points, the overblown situation, the Sagan and Ben, they're not living up to their contracts, yada, yada, yada. That's just like the nature of it, unfortunately, with what they're being paid. I guess one more for you. You can touch on it quickly, too. I'm interested in the kind of the goaltender situation because, of course, Gustafsson, I think he's probably taking control, right? He's the number one now. You think Fleury still has it in him? Is he still able to be the old Flower we're used to seeing?
I think he can give that in punches.
Yeah, exactly. Mhm.
I feel like the split and the decision to go with Gustafson being the guy, and Fleury being the backup, I think is going to really help
Mhm.
this team because I'm not gonna go the route of saying like, oh, Fleury's terrible, yada yada yada, because he had
Yeah,
some great games this past season, but you just are kind of rolling the dice more the older a player gets, and
yeah.
especially somebody who is as mobile and demonstrative in net as Marc-Andre
Very
Fleury
chaotic.
is.
Yeah.
Chaotic is a fantastic
He's like a
word
little
for
Marty
it.
Turco in him where he's
It's an
Yeah.
adventure,
Mhm.
and you just kind of hold your breath and hope that by the time the puck is iced that everything is okay.
Yep.
But he can still be a good changeup
Mhm.
to Philip Gustafson. I just would like to see, and I've heard comments from Dean Evason that they're going to give both guys opportunities out of the gate, which is
Mhm.
smart because
Yeah.
you don't want to overload one guy or the other right off the bat. But that then as the season goes on, they'll kind of take from how each guy is playing who gets what starts. And if we just go based off of what they did last year, Philip Gustafson should run away with this
Yeah.
competition. And so if he gets 45, if he gets 50 starts, I think I just would like to see Gustafson get the big opportunities,
Yeah.
the first game of a back-to-back or the game against the tougher opponent in a
Mhm.
back-to-back, starting off a tough road trip. Things like that that just are indicators of, hey, he's the guy,
Yeah,
he's the one
exactly.
that's going to get these
Mhm.
opportunities. And so, whatever the start split ends up being, just roll with Gus Bus
Yeah.
anytime you get a tough opponent and you're in a must-win situation. Because that's the other thing about number one goalies, as you are familiar with, and Stars fans are familiar with Jake Ottinger, having a guy who can stop a losing streak, who can limit
Yeah.
an opponent to one goal when you're struggling to score. Any of those things, if Gustafson gets the opportunities in those situations to help keep this team afloat and on track, that's what a number one guy does.
Very important. And, you can give up 3 in the game, but when there's 5 minutes left to go and you're up by 1, can you get that stop, right? You gotta
Yeah.
get that stop. And yeah, I mean, you gotta think too, like, who's your game 7 netminder? Who you rolling with? And, I think Gustafson's a terrific netminder. I mean, he's still so young, and you got another one in the pipelines with Wellstat. I know people are very excited about too.
Yeah, the future is bright
Mhm.
for the Minnesota Wild between the pipes, and the hope is that that will keep them up near the top of the division standings, which we are going to discuss to finish today's crossover episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Stars after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Stars. Once again, make sure you subscribe to both shows on your favorite podcast platforms and on YouTube. The season is getting ever
Mhm.
closer, and you don't want to miss out on any big news for either the Minnesota Wild or the Dallas Stars. So make sure to follow along. We will keep you up to date with everything that you need to know, such as Central Division standings.
Oh, yeah.
We've got an interesting assortment of
Mhm.
teams that are in the Central Division, Joey. Whether it be the Chicago Blackhawks, who are Connor Bedard is going to help, but
Yeah.
they're still a ways away from really climbing to the top. So you got them
Mhm.
on one end. You've got Dallas and Colorado fighting at the top. I still am of the belief that the Minnesota Wild have enough to where if you're going to tier this out, you've got Dallas and Colorado up here. You got a little bit of a space, and the Minnesota Wild slot in underneath. And then you've got St. Louis, you've got Winnipeg, you've got Nashville. Um, all are going to be fighting for the scraps.
Mhm.
And yes, I'm going to put it that way because it's just it's a weird kind of a mix between all of
Mhm.
those teams. They have equal parts kind of young talent, equal parts just weird fits, and equal parts old veterans. And
Yeah.
so I'm kind of the belief that those guys will be fighting maybe to the end of the season for a potential wild card spot.
Mhm.
But I think we're going to again see Dallas, Colorado, and Minnesota up at the top of the division. I just don't really see anybody that challenges that.
I would completely agree with you too. It really is weird because there's some teams that are kind of basically just right at the beginning of their rebuild, right? With your Arizona and your Chicago's who are hoping to get better in the future, and then I feel like every team as well just has question marks. Like, I mean, Colorado's going to be without Landeskog. How's that going to look? I mean, still they got tons of talent. I get that, but they did lose some guys in the offseason. I mean, who knows with the Stars? Are not the most defensive depth, and is Ottinger going to hold up for another year, having to kind of be the man and kind of clean up every mess. And I would completely agree. I think it's really interesting. I would put the Stars and the Avalanche up top, and Minnesota right in that third spot. It's not as deep as a division as we've been accustomed to, and there's probably not as much parity. I could only see 3 Central Division teams making the playoffs. I think the Pacific is going to be pretty deep with LA and Edmonton. And who knows with Calgary, with Suter now finally leaving, like their Sutter's gone. So is that offense going to turn around? I don't know. Maybe they'll get better net minding. They need that for sure. So there could only be 3 teams coming out of the Central. There could be 5 because
right.
Like who knows with Nashville too, because they're not, rebuilding, but they're just kind of in this transition now with getting rid of Johansson and Duchesne. Saros is still a great netminder too. He can carry that team. And of course, in Winnipeg, you got that Rick Bowness who was leading the Central Division for like 85% of the year before that collapse in the final month. They should not even have been in the playoffs.
No.
Yeah, they should not have been there. It was a really bad final month for them. And yeah, what's that going to look like? Because Bowness didn't make a lot of friends in his final month there.
No, he certainly told it how it was. The only problem is that a lot of the players on the team did not want to hear what he thought was wrong. So you've got that. And I don't know about you, but if there's one team that's going to kind of shock and surprise, I'm fully on the Arizona Coyotes bandwagon.
Yeah.
I love the moves that they made because they have such a great young offensive core. They supplemented it with fantastic vets. Jason Zucker, one of my favorite players all time. You add him in. You've got Nick Bjugstad, who is sneaky good as a bottom 6 guy. You get Matt Dumba. And I feel like if there's one team that can kind of gel together and emerge from a bunch of teams that just really don't know what they are, I feel like it's Arizona. And I might be a year or two early on this, but if there was ever a time for a team to rise above just the chaotic mess that is going to be 4 through 6 in this division, if there's ever a time for a team to crawl through and emerge, it's this year.
Yeah, I mean, it's always that one team, right? There's always that one team that turns heads. And with Logan Cooley, and we saw his unreal goal in the preseason, like he looks every bit of the part. And I'm sure a lot of Minnesotans are familiar with him, and he terrorized the Huskies for quite a bit too as a Golden Gopher. So yeah, you never know. And they got, you kind of have that mix, and two, they have nothing to lose. And that's sometimes the most dangerous team to play, right? They're not expected to do anything. So yeah, they're going to come out there and punch you in the mouth. And they say this a lot in the NFL. The Cowboys fans, talk about the opponent. They pay their players too, right? They're not going to just lay down. They get paid, so they're going to come, and they got nothing to lose, and they could be very dangerous. But yeah, I would agree with you too. That may be a dangerous team, or maybe just becoming the Wild of the South now too, with Bjugstad and Zucker all heading down there, and Dumba.
It is really the Wild West. Depending on how you look at it, there are just so many players, it seems like, that circulate through Minnesota to other spots. So we'll see how it plays out, but that will wrap up for today's episode. Joey, thank you for joining. Wild fans, make sure if you're looking for a little bit on the Dallas Stars that you give Joey a follow and follow along with Locked On Stars. Either way, make sure you follow both shows and subscribe on your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes, which come your way every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.